Welcome to Battersea for the first of what we are going to do is 4 separate presentations on different topics. I'm Sandy Graham. I'm president of Battersea. I've been president of Battersea for like 15 or more years. So we've done a lot of thinking about Battersea. You see things change out here from time to time. We always have a group of projects going on. But we've never done lots of heavy-duty research that we really felt like we needed to do. Okay? Okay, yeah. And so, and part of our mission is to enrich and inform and teach and that kind of thing, and yet, you know, we spent most of the first 15 or 20 years working on the building and holding some nice events like the Oyster event and things like that out here. But we have not really started to do anything to tell the stories. And this place is full. And the people who lived here and so on, we'll talk about that in just a minute. But it's time, I thought, to have what we're just going to call a speaker series. This is the first one. We're going to do one on horticulture and botany at Battersea because of all the discoveries with the gardens and things of that sort. Hi. We're going to do one about Colonel Simcoe and the Queen's Rangers, the British troops who occupied this place multiple times. We've got a plaque that's been on the front wall here out of marble that mentions Simcoe. And so he is a real player in the Revolutionary War for the British. And so he liked it so much he kept coming back and stealing the horses and stealing the pigs, that kind of thing. And we're going to do one, what's the other one? Horse racing. And you know, you might say, why horse racing? Well, this was one of the places where horse racing in the 18th century really occurred in colonial Virginia. There were 4 racetracks here, professional racetracks, before 1800, more than any today in the country in any one city. There were 4 of them here. With a population of 3,000 people, you had 4 professional horse racing tracks. Wow. And Banister raised racehorses here. We know that. He sold them to famous people. He and George Washington would sit around at these races, bet against each other, and all kinds of things. So we're going to develop all of those talks and get them out to you as soon as we can. We're now at the mercy of finding the speakers and when their schedules will free up. So we wanted to get these done in the first 2 months of this year. I think that's not going to happen. But we'll keep you posted through the website and other things about where we are, new dates for those events. A few housekeeping matters. We've got, I'm pleased to say, restrooms in this building now. Yeah. And so we've got one up the steps right here. We've got one through the yellow room into our storage room kind of area. There's another bathroom there. Please feel free to use those as you like. We've put out some waters, some cold waters. If you'd like to get one of those, that's in the yellow room over here. You can do it now, later, or we're going to take a break about halfway through. And it's just to sort of readjust. And the second half, that is really going to be more questions and answers and probing a little bit into some of the factual things that we have found here and that Davis has found. Davis has written his thesis on John Banister, just very recently completed. He is an historical researcher here at Battersea for about the last year and a half or so, Davis?
April 2023.
Okay. And so we've got him on lots of projects, and it's great to have somebody who can actually check out the facts, because there are a lot of facts that have been misunderstood and maybe misrepresented over the years. So we're going to try to straighten some of that out today. But today is about the letters. We've had letters for a number of years from famous people like Washington and Jefferson and Patrick Henry with this guy, John Banister. And it's disappointing when you've got a great letter and you can't find a response to the letter, that kind of thing, you know. So you don't get the full story, but you get a sense of who John Banister was connected with. These were his friends. They were here. They came to this house. They were involved in war together, they were involved in business ventures together. So with all that going on, we decided to look at the letters and see whether they will tell us more than we know already about a very complicated person named John Banister. And here's an alert to everybody. Everybody in this that we're talking about in this lecture is named John Banister. So we got 4 of them. And so we got to pay attention and see if we can get Davis to keep us straight on that. But everybody was named John Banister. So, and they didn't do us the favor of putting a 2 and 3 after their names and things like that on the letters. So you got to figure it out by the dates and that sort of thing. So in any event, with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Davis and please take it away.
Thank you very much. So today I put together a piece of programming centered around analyzing these letters that Banister wrote during mainly what was the American Revolution. So if we start off here, we can get a little bit into the background of who John Banister was. So he was born December 26th, 1734, from Dinwiddie County, to John and William Banister. Now, in compiling the family genealogy throughout the presentation and throughout my research, yeah, they don't like titles. It's definitely not the William Byrds of Virginia. They just kind of go by their names. So Banister is actually the 3rd and potentially 4th in his family line and has children and grandchildren all named John Banister. So dates and assembling letters together are very important and compromising exactly who and what people exactly we're talking about when it comes to the period. So Banister was born in 1734. He gets his law education in England in 1753, where he studies at the Middle Temple. So he goes for the traditional approach to education for founders of the time. Not a fan of William and Mary, doesn't explicitly make it, but he decides to go through the more traditional approach, which is traveling overseas to England and getting his education there. Banister, of course, itself is a very English last name in origin. Battersea, London is where Banister's family originally immigrated from in the late 17th century and is suspected to be what the house is named after, the area in that his family came from. Does not explicitly made, but very likely given the context of his English heritage. So, flash forward to 1768, and we have the Battersea House, which is built about that time. He was born at Hatcher's Run in Dinwiddie County, which was his family plantation that was owned by his father and his grandfather before, which is about 10 minutes this way of Dinwiddie. If you're on 460, you'll see the state marker sign, which kind of analyzes his life and legacy, and is just nowadays owned by a landscaping company, so it's not, unfortunately, not the original building still exists, and it's inaccessible to the public. And he also had another home by the name of Whitehall during the Revolution, which is over in Prince George County, and also does not exist today. We continue to his background on the next page. We get to learn a bit about who Banister was during his lifetime. So he gets his start in his law career and during the 1760s as a House of Burgesses member, one of the representatives at the time. And as he progresses on throughout his career, gets a bit more of a following. He becomes a Virginia Convention representative. So all my St. John's Church fans out there, Patrick Henry fans, liberty or death. He's one of the Dinwiddie County representative for all 5 of the Virginia conventions during the Revolution. And further beyond that, he also becomes a second continental congressman and his biggest claim to fame, a signer of the Articles of Confederation, which is the first constitution prior to the official constitution in 1787. Shout out Perry, Articles of Conversation was a better title than I could ever come up with for a lecture series, so thank you very much for that. This brings us to setting the time period. So during the American Revolution prior to, we had the early 1770s pre-war. This influences a lot of Banister's politics and what would happen for his input during the Revolution. As we all know, the Boston Massacre, 1770, More locally, we have the Virginia Non-Importation Resolutions, a series of agreements that were signed by many Virginians, Jefferson, Banister, many others, signed to prevent the importation of British goods as a way to protest taxation. And afterwards, of course, most famously, the Boston Tea Party. During the Virginia conventions, the relationship between Boston and Virginia is brought up quite frequently. That's a point made when they're trying to decide whether or not should we go to war against Britain. Boston is often seen, and Massachusetts more so, seen as the sister colony to Virginia, and Banister was definitely one of those people that believed so. It's important to support your fellow colonies and to work together against Britain. Which brings us to the Adams family on the next spot, John and Sam Adams, and the first of the letters that Banister co-wrote. On December 16, 1774, Banister, along with John Tapp in Amelia County, two Virginia Convention representatives, they write a letter to John and Sam Adams. After hearing about what had happened during the Boston Tea Party and the aftermath and how essentially the entire economy was shut down, Banister and Tapp, both Virginia planters, decide that they want to show their support and do so by shipping rations, grain, contributions from Amelia and Dinwiddie all the way to Boston for their, quote, spirited conduct and their great preservation in the cause of American liberty. Banister, during the Second Virginia Convention, the votes today, how he voted is not specifically preserved, but based on what was happening during the convention, during the time, it is highly likely that based on his connection and his feelings towards Massachusetts and Boston, that he definitely supported in favor of liberty during that convention. And through this letter, we can see that not only he was feeling that way, but also his fellow countrymen. John Tabb, who's a fellow planter and also a representative during the convention, felt this way enough to supply their own funds to people miles and miles away, just for their preservation and what they believed for their cause of American liberty. Do you have any points on that? Do you want to say something?
We don't know where that grain came from, but it is quite possible because John Banister and his family had owned the mills right along the Appomattox River, right below this house. So this was an early industrial revolution site, and it resulted from the Appomattox River being non-navigable, lots and lots of rapids and so on, right through here, lots of rocks, until you get down to where VSU is, and that's the fall line. On the other side is navigable. And downtown Petersburg was a port city for many, many years, and you wouldn't know that by looking at it today, because it's infilled and so on, and there's lots of talk about having all of that dredged and opening up the port, if you will, again, and for people bringing small boats up the river. So there was and one of the reasons this house was built here, and I'll get back to you, Davis, in just a minute, we think was because the family owned the land here for years before John Banister actually decided to build a building. And so, as I say, some of the earliest industrial mills were down there. They were grist mills. In time of war, they converted that to gunpowder mills. Lots of wars were fought while the Banister family lived here. And then cotton mills. And so there was these buildings are not here any longer, but they were up and down this section of the river toward Petersburg. And there are pictures of some of the more recent buildings, like mid-1800s and that kind of thing. But you can see from that why Petersburg was a target during the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, because the troops could be fed and clothed and everything out of Petersburg. And this is one place where that happened.
Waterways are your 95 and 64 at the time, essentially. I think the Banister family original land grant was something around like 1,700 acres. So they've had a lot of land around here in the Dinwiddie, Petersburg area. But if we move on now, we get to about the mid to late 1770s. We get to the point where Banister is advancing more in his career and is becoming more federally known. Liberty or Death, of course, he's one of the representatives for that. 6, and it'll bring us to our next letter, Valley Forge, in the later 1770s. If we take a look at the next page, that brings us into what I call the Henry Wars, where Banister shares some correspondence with Virginia Governor at the time, Patrick Henry. The letter here, unfortunately, we do not have the responses that Henry wrote to Banister, but we do have 2 letters from 1770 that he wrote to Henry. Henry, of course, at the time, was a very busy guy, first governor of Virginia, dealing with something along the lines of the gunpowder problem in Williamsburg. But Banister is writing from York at the time, so during the Continental Congress, he is writing from York, Pennsylvania, and he writes to Henry about the quality and what is happening with the Virginia troops and the Army at the time. Banister is going to serve on what's called the Committee of Arrangements during his tenure in Congress, which is essentially a body organized to reforming the Continental Army and ensuring its standards. Usually this is attributed mainly to Washington and Baron von Steuben during the time. Banister is sort of more of the diplomatic person, your HR, your company boss, if you will, coming and check on the situation and see what's going on to make sure everything's following the standards. But in this letter here from Henry, we do learn a little bit about how he's talking about the regional effects of the Army and how Virginia and Carolinas, people are arriving at camps. And he's really talking less about Virginia in general and more so is looking at the 13 colonies as a whole. You're really starting to understand the camaraderie that the states are starting to share together in their wars against the British. This is in March of 1778, so when Banister is just starting to serve in this Continental Congress term. And second letter, which was in April or so, shorter this time, he even starts to address things like smallpox and how that's starting to wreak its havoc on the Army and how he's talking about inoculation. Pretty primitive medical practice for the time, not a big fan of it. I'm assuming most people are. Inoculation at the time is essentially taking a scalpel to someone's foot and or arm and getting fluid strained into it so that you can help immunize yourself against smallpox. But as we can see, smallpox at the time is a huge problem, especially for the Continental Army. Washington himself got smallpox and was lucky enough to survive and had immunity to it for the rest of the war. And because it was such a massive danger and threat to the Army, they decided, well, we, as a part of the Committee of Arrangements, we need to actually take this matter seriously and start upping our practices to ensure that we actually have a standing army and can stand a chance against the British.
Davis, one of the things you told me, gosh, it must have been about a year or so ago, that you were reading about the British and how they were, at the end of the war, weaponizing African Americans that had been released free because of their invasions in the various plantations and so on, and they were weaponizing them through the use of smallpox and actually sending them back home to infect the people they worked for and the people they would meet.
So upon further research, we've actually looked into that more and more, and that is a contentious point of debate during among scholars in the American Revolution. There is various sources from the time period, like letters of Cornwallis or Simcoe or British officials at the time, that are showing that debate as to whether or not they were purposely using smallpox as biological warfare. Earlier in the 17th century, in cases with Native Americans and or English colonists, there were mentions of smallpox blankets and intentional internal warfare. And in the case of the American Revolution with Simcoe, it's still debated as to whether or not it was intentionally done, but there are letters and periods that can suggest that from the time, depending upon the interpretation of the Petersburg campaign and the British effect in the 1780s, which we will get to with General Simcoe and Benedict Arnold in the early 1780s. This brings us to our next point, what I call the Washington relationship, where we do have 2 letters from Banister, actually 1 letter from Banister and 1 from Washington. During 1770s. And at this point, Banister is in Pennsylvania, he's in York, and Washington is, of course, stationed at Valley Forge. It was actually mentioned in some early secondary sources from the 1930s that were coincidentally written by descendants of John Banister. They said that he was a major in the army at Valley Forge. That's not the case. There actually were several men with the name of Banister at the time. But we do know that Banister did share correspondence with Washington while he was at his seat in the Continental Congress. And in this relatively short letter, we have one from Banister talking to Washington, again, state of the Army, reenlistments of the Virginia regiments, and talking about the complexity of the war. And at this point, around the time of Valley Forge, how it's starting to look pretty grim. I'm talking about resolution, Virginia's drafted men, and of course, how there's deserters at this point in time. It's not looking like a great situation. We can also see that in the next letter, Washington to Banister, we have a uncharacteristically long letter. For those that read Washington, generally, I would say it's better nowadays, but for a while he was usually getting the stoic interpretation of his character as somebody that sort of suppressed his emotions, lead, and help inspire confidence among revolutionaries. But in this letter, we see something a little different. What was ended up originally as about 2.5, 3-page letter, we see Washington sort of very emotional, very sort of pouring his heart out in the case to Banister, which is rather odd given his correspondence, but also very telling of where he's at the time. April of 1778, again, Valley Forge, just having winter at the time, it's not looking good. He's questioning the ideas of American liberty and what we're even standing for at this point in time. And it's fascinating to think that he would send this to somebody as John Banister, which I'm sure most people don't know. If you ask anybody today who John Banister is, most people are not aware of. In my interpretation of this piece, I see it as, well, he's actually talking to somebody that he trusts greatly, more as a friend, more of a private matter than somebody that he would just share formal business with.
This letter, I think, is probably the most telling letter I've ever seen from George Washington. He really is emotional. He is very worried about whether the American troops can win this war or not. And there are some footnotes that go with the letter, and it talks about things like, what are the Spaniards going to do? Are the French going to come to our aid or not? And if they don't, there's a good chance we're going to lose this war. And so it's an interesting timing when he's got, hundreds of commissioned officers who are resigning those commissions daily. He even mentions 90 officers from Virginia who had recently resigned their commissions because they wanted to go home. I mean, they had to eat, they had to provide for their families and all of this. And so he was very, very worried that there wasn't going to be sufficient military expertise on the American side to actually get through this war.
Go ahead. There's actually one excerpt here that I think summarizes his feelings towards it perfectly, where he says, "We must take the passions of men as nature has given them, and principles as a guide, which are generally the rule of action. I do not mean to exclude altogether the idea of patriotism. I know that it exists, and I know it has done much to present in the present contest, but the idea will venture to assert that as a great and lasting war can never be supported on this principle alone." So he has his ideas and he has his movement forward, but he's worried very much so about the practicality. Are people and the soldiers going to put their money where their mouth is, quite frankly?
And I think, if I'm right on this, Davis, this letter made it from Valley Forge to this building
So yeah,
in like 3 days?
I mean, it's pretty short. So the original letter from Banister was dated April 16th, and then the next one is April 21st. I'm not a Pennsylvanian, but from York to Valley Forge, I think that's quite a drive. much more so by a horseback. So that's got to be some record time letter delivery in that case. So that takes care of the Washington relationship, at least for now. Maybe we'll find some more letters in the future. But this brings us to our business with Sherman. So, as a part of the Committee of Arrangements, Banister also begins networking with members from the Northeast. This brings him to his relationship with Roger Sherman. In September of 1778, we now talk and we have a co-written letter to one of the colonels of Rhode Island in which he talks as the Committee of Arrangements. And he's essentially saying, get it together, guys. We're getting late in the war and we need to get serious about this. But we're showing that Banister is going beyond Virginia, Pennsylvania, and now we're all the way up to Rhode Island. He's really taking this Committee of Arrangements seriously and trying to implement the changing policies to get half the Army and the Revolution into the direction that they're going for. It's essentially his travel of his job, if you will. During his Continental Congress tenure, he's still doing this and traveling from state to state during active war.
That Committee of Arrangements is a very odd thing in my parlance. I mean, what does it really mean? What was the job? And as best I can tell, it's logistics. That was what he was good at. Banister was good at. And because he was, for years, had been running a pretty sizable business here and in Dinwiddie County, and shipping all of this tobacco out and so on down the river, down to Norfolk, and then across the ocean to London. And he figured out how to do that efficiently and how to do it where he can make a lot of money. And so I think Washington, or someone like Washington, talked him into this special appointment with the Committee of Arrangements and just wanted his expertise in being able to supply an army.
I really just see it as upper management. I really think he would have been great in the corporate field, in modern corporate business. He's basically going to these camps and these places and saying, all right, guys, we got to follow company policy. This brings us to the 1780s. We're getting towards the end of the Revolution now. It brings us to probably the worst year for Banister, the worst year for Petersburg and Richmond, 1781. So at this point, the British are putting in their last sort of retaliation for the war, and we have Benedict Arnold's raid on Richmond and Petersburg. In case of Banister, this is a nightmare. He's serving as the colonel of cavalry for Dinwiddie County and is charged with protecting Petersburg. He's outnumbered a lot, to the point where he sees the British forces pull up and decides, all right, it's time to go chill out at Hatcher's Run for a while. So, I don't think that's a very favorable outcome for anyone, but what eventually results in the Battle of Petersburg, Banister's writing from his home at Hatcher's Run from 1781, 1782, and is essentially commuting back and forth between Battersea when it's safe. He's relocating his family in what seems to be his few moments of emotional care, and he's genuinely worried about the safety of his family and keeping them in the more secluded rural plantation home of Dinwiddie, as opposed to Battersea, which is the main city house, commutable, very close to Petersburg, very close to British occupation during the time period. Battersea gets occupied by the British 3 times during the war. We get questions during the time, it's like, well, why, if they've occupied it that many times, why don't they just burn the place? Like, isn't that what they do? But Battersea, I mean, given its location, its size, right next to the Appomattox River, the interpretation that I have, and most have, is that, well, it's more useful alive than dead. Why would you destroy such a valuable resource, especially right next to mills, which Banister reproduced to make gunpowder during the war, which is very, very important commodable resource. You can't fight a war without gunpowder, and you can't fight a war without ships, both of which the Appomattox River and Battersea provides for the time.
And so every time they came here, it was basically like a refueling station for the Army. It's pretty well documented that all of the horses were stolen every time, and they were quality horses. So they were obviously used for horse racing. They were bred on this property. And so they'd take the pigs. Your army's got to have food. And so that's the kind of thing they were interested in. They didn't care about the building, although I suspect some of the officers, of course, were inside at night, and the enlisted people were outside in their tents. But it was a nice place to stop, and it is still a little surprising that the mills were not burned down or pulled down. I think the British believed that they were going to win this war, and why do something stupid like take down the mills? They were going to belong to the British Empire.
Banister actually does make note when the occupation of the campaign actually does begin. He starts by mentioning they've already attacked my Whitehall plantation. They've refreshed themselves, translate to looted and stolen all the supplies. And by that time, they did the same thing when they get to Battersea. Banister actually recovers later at in Yorktown, according to a journal entry by Joseph Plum Martin, that he actually does receive some of his supplies back, tools, enslaved people at the time, and was able to recover at least a noticeable portion of it, as indicated later by his tax records, to get some of his wealth and influence back.
Elaine, do you have a question?
Yeah, remember that room that Chris found above
Yeah.
where they stored all the silverware?
Yeah, at Battersea, we've got a faux room, a fake room. Second story on the east end of the building. There's no way to get there. There's no staircase. And when you get on a tall ladder and look through those windows from the outside, which we've done a couple of times, there's no flooring even in there, just studs and things of that sort. So it was the kind of place that you could access. There are windows on the outside. And it's where the squirrels are getting in, by the way. We had squirrels chew through a lot of electric wire here and knock out our air conditioning and heating system a few weeks ago. So we've had all of that fixed. But it is the kind of room that you just wonder about. What was it used for? I mean, the Palladian architecture, of course, was very symmetrical. Okay, even if you didn't need a room up there, you would make it look like the other side of the house. But that's a mystery room, and I actually pushed Governor Gilmore's wife through a hole in the ceiling here about 10, 15 years ago, because she was just dying to, she was an historian and so on, who died a few years ago. But she wanted to be the first one to see what was up there. So delicately, I tried to find a place to put my hands to push her through the hole in the ceiling. So.
Interesting point to know, during that same campaign in the 1780s, there actually, if you look outside when you're walking past Battersea, there's a sign from the DAR chapter, the Francis Bland Randolph chapter, that was put up in 1911. They actually put up a sign that's on the outside of Battersea that says occupied by the British Colonel Simcoe during the Revolution. And they estimated the house to be built about 1760, which today we think is closer to 1768.
1768 is the right date for lots of reasons. I think they started building it in 1766. There were a number of advertisements in the Williamsburg Gazette where a fellow from Scotland was looking for skilled labor for a big project in Petersburg. And so he must have found that labor. The house was begun in 1766 and finished in 1768. And in 1768, he placed another ad in the paper saying, "Leaving the colony now, I finished the work I was doing and went on to another commission out of state." So the bookend dates match exactly from those ads to when this project was started and was completed. So we know pretty sure that that's the case. And those ads were placed by the person who I believe, did the original woodwork in this house, which is just exceptional. and he was a Scottish carver.
So following the Revolution, this brings us to what I call the Jefferson series. I call it a series because there's so many letters between Banister and Jefferson and heading to Jefferson had a habit of keeping notes and taking and writing letters. I sometimes like to joke that he probably recorded his own bathroom schedule as much as he writes, but I mean, with the correspondence he has to Banister, we picked 2 letters here today just to show the relationship the 2 men had. But there's many letters between the 2. And that's mainly because Banister and Jefferson were family friends. Even more so than his relationship with Washington, Jefferson shares what I refer to as just a very personal familial relationship. To the point where with his first letter from June 16, 1785, following the Revolution, Banister is talking about his firstborn son, John Banister Jr. So because they like to continue the names for generations upon generations, Banister Jr. is his first son from his first marriage, and the one that he places a considerable amount of time into raising. He actually tries to have him educated overseas, again, following the family tradition, and has him under Jefferson's mentorship in Paris. While Jefferson is abroad overseas, he is essentially having him be raised by him. Is having Banister Jr. mentored under Thomas Jefferson. There's a whole bunch of it that happens during this series. There's like Banister Jr. being reckless with money spending. There's some stolen identities in there. It's a long story. But the gist of it is that essentially Banister is close enough with Jefferson that he trusts him to have his son mentored overseas. And at the time, of course, this is from Virginia to Paris. That's no easy commute going overseas. That could be like as many as 3 months just going in one direction.
It's not like Jefferson didn't have anything to do other than watch out for Banister's children. I mean, he was the minister to France, appointed by Congress, and he spent an awful lot of time with Banister's son, who was not well. You'll see some evidence of that in the letters that he was ill, and Banister Sr., Banister III, inquires of Jefferson, how is his health? And to fast forward real quickly on that, Jack, who was his firstborn son, died roughly at the same time as John Banister.
So they realized very quickly on that the John Banister name was getting old. So John Banister Jr., our Banister's first son, they often refer to him as Jack in correspondence, just to help try and differentiate it a little bit. But Sandy is right, because Banister dies, our Banister, John Banister, dies September 30th, 1788, and just several weeks after Jack dies as well. They were both, according to correspondence, both sickly individuals, which we'll get into a little bit as we go on through the letters here. But in our next letter, we actually have Banister's follow-up to Jefferson, January 19th, 1786, where he talks about his relationship with his son. Again, he has to date it from Virginia, and it's 1786. It's taken a long time to get these letters back and forth to each other, just because overseas and distance. But keeps it short, keeps it simple, talking about their health, talking about his son, and is hopeful towards the education of what would be the successor to the Banister family. And you can see that Banister, the correspondence goes far beyond this. These are just some of the excerpts that we have, a couple of the letters that showcase this relationship, but just to summarize it is what we pulled for today's analysis.
And just to put a finer point on it, I guess, I mean, it is real clear that Jefferson and Banister were friendly, comrades, confidants, and all of that. Jefferson was 10 years younger than Banister. And because Banister died early, and this house, by the way, sat essentially vacant for 35 years after the death of Banister because of the infighting among his children and the relatives. They could not figure out what to do with it. And it wasn't just that it was a grand house and a lot of responsibility. By the time that Banister died, he was heavily in debt.
Much like his friend Jefferson.
Yeah, they were all, and I mean, the war had done them in. And so, Banister was borrowing money here. He was borrowing money from his creditors in London. And the reason for it, of course, was he couldn't ship tobacco out of here for that long period of time. The British had blocked, it was a blockade. I mean, the Appomattox goes into the James River, and then the James River then goes out to the ocean right at Norfolk. And then they would traditionally unload those fairly large ships into ocean-going vessels, and then that's when the tobacco then went straight to London. But if that is your main source of income, and occasional income from the mills, you're assumed without money to maintain that lifestyle.
The Banister estate is a nightmare after Banister's passing in 1788, which you actually see in these next letters, which we'll get to in a minute, shows the follow-up to that and what causes it. But essentially, after Banister dies, he's got a laundry list of executors in his will, and he's got at least several children by this point, none of whom are still living. Jack dies months after his will, or after his death, and beyond that point, I mean, all of his children are minors, and he's got executors, and of course his second wife and heir. So it just becomes a logistical and legal nightmare, all the way up until this 1820s, early to mid 1820s is when Battersea is finally sold, and up to that point, his children from his second marriage, his youngest children, who were toddlers by the time he dies, 30 years something later, by the 1820s, they're adults. And they have legal rights to the properties. That's how long this estate mess and management goes on for.
And one sort of other aspect that we haven't gotten into yet, but somebody needs to look at it, in my opinion, is the role of Judge John May in settling the estate. He was he was a practicing lawyer here in Petersburg. He was already a fairly wealthy guy, and invested in industries along the river as well. Later in his career, he was on the Virginia Supreme Court. But he is one of the people who ended up being instrumental in resolving the estate litigation, and the way he resolved it was to buy Battersea.
And just for context, May was Battersea's second owner and a distant relative of the Banister family. It was like second cousin or something. But essentially, yeah, he becomes the second owner and the holder for the foreseeable future.
So that tells you something about Judge May we haven't even talked about yet, but it is worrisome, I think, that he could have been looking out for himself and not for the Banister family. Yes, ma'am.
So wouldn't his wife and small children have been living here, or maybe in that time the house just didn't go to the will?
So essentially what happens with the estate is that Banister's second wife is not allowed as much as probably a good husband would allow her in his will in 1788. He's placing most of his faith in his executors and his sons at the time. But Banister has several children. Jack, of course, who dies in December, several months after his father. Two younger sons that die prematurely, two daughters, which the daughters are never treated very well, very responsibly, unfortunately. And he has, from his second marriage, he just has two sons, but at the time of the writing of the will, they are toddlers. They're just very, very young children. And so even then, Banister is placing more faith and will into his toddler sons than his second wife.
And there are also lots of stories that haven't been fully developed or researched about Judge May and his connection with Jefferson, which he had a real connection with Jefferson. And there's even a hint, maybe not much more than a hint, that Judge May wrote one of the big checks to Jefferson to start the academical village in Charlottesville.
Wow.
So that's a lot of connections. And you've seen the window, if you've been here, in the blue room, absolute, identical to the ones at Monticello. And so there were a lot of relationships here. People came and went through this building for all kinds of reasons. They were advising on agriculture, they were breeding horses, they were talking about the architecture here, and Judge May made a number of changes in this building. And it's not inconceivable that Jefferson was in charge of a lot of that.
The two portraits of Judge May and his wife in the room to our left here are actually on hold or held in the collections of the Fremont Museum at Charlottesville today.
They're both by Thomas Sully, the best known portrait painter in the world. At that time, he painted Queen Victoria 7 times. He was the only person allowed to paint the portrait of Queen Victoria. And he painted the portraits of Judge May and his wife, which are in the Fralin Museum in Charlottesville today, and were given to the Fralin Museum by descendants of Judge May.
In the, you can see in the next letter that we have here from Jefferson to Banister Jr., Jack, in February 1787, you can see that he is talking again about money, and constantly Jack is, of course, a young adult overseas abroad in Paris. He's a little reckless with his finances, but so is Jefferson. So they get into some shenanigans with that, and you get to see how Banister is essentially responsible for the deaths of his son. And then for all of you botanists and naturalists out there, there's on the second page on the enclosure, you actually get to see some of the plants and horticulture that was established at Battersea with Jefferson. The gardening that was done at Battersea at the time was very similar to the stylistic choices of Jefferson in a similar fashion, with the Palladian architecture that has the Greek, Roman, sort of Renaissance influenced style.
And so this letter is sort of the point where we would depart and start thinking about our second speaker in the series, which is botany and horticulture at Battersea. We know a lot about it, partly from these letters with Jefferson. We are now beginning to see a lot of evidence of this with the archaeological work that's now being done right here in the front yard by William and Mary. Battersea has been selected by Garden Club of Virginia for a grant that will fund an architectural landscape student, graduate student, who will be here all summer this year, looking for the flowers, looking for what was grown here. There was no tobacco grown here. It was all flowers. Remember the Banister family, and we haven't really dwelled on it, but Banister number 1, the grandfather, was this country's first botanist. Wrote a book this thick in the 1690s.
As a sort of product of the scientific revolution, he was an English naturalist that was responsible for sort of educating the universities at the time on the history of botany in the natural state of Virginia. There's actually a fantastic book that was done in the 70s that focuses on the botanical history of Virginia and that Banister's role in sort of developing the knowledge of the scientific revolution at the time.
There's some anecdotal evidence about the gardens here. You can't see it today, but there was an ad in a Philadelphia newspaper in the 1820s when this building was being advertised for sale in Philadelphia. And the ad included some language that said, "It has the finest garden south of Philadelphia." And so we believe that was probably true. I mean, all the evidence points to the family being so interested in that John Banister would have done so as well. And so that's why the Garden Club of Virginia is coming. They want to know everything that happened here with that. We've now got exposed outside some long sections of a brick walkway made of the same bricks that were in this building. It's not on the parterre, the flat area right outside the front, but that drops down 4 or 5 steps. And then this particular walkway is, if you stand on the front porch, it's to the left of the driveway and goes all the way down to the gate. And it appears that there was an alley of Osage orange trees along the entrance to this place. And the one that fell over now almost 3 years ago during a really bad storm is what tipped us off to that, because when that root ball came out of the ground, there were 100 bricks attached to it. And so we moved the tree and all that, and the archaeologists have now unearthed a big section of that so you can see it. They said that there are some interruptions in the walkway that's not continuous, but probably because the rest of the Osage orange trees had also fallen over at some point in time, right? We've only got one left. It's the one right at the entrance gate. So every time this event happened, the tree blows over and the bricks go everywhere. It obviously interrupts the pattern of the walkway. So we think, well, it was on both sides of the driveway. We don't know yet. But we're looking at all kinds of things in the front yard now, and it's fascinating.
That brings us to the last page that we have here as far as Banister is concerned. You can see this image of the DHR sign that's out there over on 460 in Dinwiddie County today. Serves as sort of a summary of Banister's life right outside of his Hatcher's Run plantation where he was likely buried. We actually, the foundation, managed to visit the site in recent years to try and determine exactly where he was buried, and unfortunately we're not able to locate his gravestone. We were able to find the gravestone of one of his daughters, Anne Mariah Banister, but unfortunately the land surrounding it was used by a logging company, and so it's essentially been stripped, and there's no remaining structures of the time. So the search for that is either unmarked or still looking for that stone in particular.
And one of the theories is that the gravestones, of course, were there. It was the family cemetery, but that with the invasions of troops and so on, there are stories about desecrating graveyards and so on. And that could well have happened.
There actually is very substantial crack that sort of looks like there was natural damage on the one surviving gravestone, so it's possible that they either damaged over time and sunken into the earth, or just been like the other theories that were proposed as well. I have a quote there from a letter to Jefferson from 1798 talking about the death of Banister and his son. They were actually frequently mentioned in correspondence at the time with regards to settling the estate. The Battersea estate, as we mentioned before, was a nightmare to handle, and for that reason there's quite a bit of paper trail between Jefferson, the executors, and as far as everyone concerning Battersea was going, there was quite a bit of messaging around that even after Banister's death, just concerning the property.
And the Dinwiddie estate?
The Dinwiddie estate is where he was buried, but the focus was mainly on Battersea. But that would have included all of his properties at the time, and settling those as well.
So this is a good time to pause, I think. I'll start with the first one, which is not on your sheet. But the question is, you've heard about Banister, you've heard about his military career, his family history. This is one of the most famous buildings in the United States. But would we even be talking about John Banister and what his place in history is if this building weren't here?
Probably not.
I don't think so.
Well, only if you're a super student of history and you're really digging for
You
things.
really, John Banister was a tough guy to research for lots of reasons. But, when you try to come up with where you place him in the pantheon of leaders of early America and so on. I mean, is he near the top? I mean, he signed the Articles of Confederation, and he was a military expert. He was a vastly wealthy person until the war happened. But I'm not so sure that, but for Battersea and its place in history, that we'd be talking about John Banister as a father of our country or a framer of these wonderful documents like the Articles of Confederation.
I can touch on both of those, but for as far as his houses are concerned, I mean, Battersea is definitely the piece, in my opinion, the piece that makes Banister at least known at all. His Whitehall, the plantation that's mentioned in his correspondence during the 1780s, that wasn't even archaeologically excavated or discovered even to this very day. It was mentioned in several of the letters from the 1780s, but not just relegated to Prince George County, which by 1780s terms could be many locations given the acreage. And Hatcher's Run, I mean, there's not even any remaining 18th century buildings that are still standing on the property today.
And I was gonna say, if you go to the landing page for the Dinwiddie Historical Society, which I remember recently, there's nothing there.
They don't.
And believe me, I am taking this back to Dinwiddie County, because I'm just floored,
Yeah.
I mean, reading Hatcher's Run, and I'm going,
Me
my
too.
God, why not?
Banister is mostly known and famous. This actually leads into another question that we have. Is he more famous as a local figure of Petersburg, which Banister most definitely is. I mean, he was the first, we didn't even touch on this yet because we were mainly focusing on his role in the American Revolution, but Banister was the first mayor of Petersburg in 1784. And even that, I mean, most local folks probably couldn't tell you about Banister even though he was the mayor of the first town. But he does still have a legacy today that's sustained through material culture. Battersea Lane is the main street sign up there. There's a Banister Street, I think, over by one of the convenience stores. And there's a couple of pieces that remain that show Banister's legacy. At the Petersburg Public Library, there's actually a Battersea floor mural when you first walk in that you can see. And there's, of course, the state marker on 460 that talks about his Hatcher's Run house, but also just relegates and talks about him as a historical figure. It's interesting that they don't have, that sign is out there and not more here in Petersburg, where he's much more well known as a figure.
The Hatcher's Run house, we have some pictures of it that we found at the Department of Historic Resources downtown. And it was smallish, it was brick, it burned, and when it burned down, there's no evidence of it today other than some bricks or whatever. But when it burned down, it apparently burned all of the family portraits, all of the silverware, the early furniture, by the way, most of which was English. You didn't get furniture being made in Petersburg till 1770, and Hatcher's Run, really preceded that date.
Yeah, this comes from the same biography that was written by one of his great grandchildren in the 1930s, where it talks about how the house that actually Banister was likely born in and raised in was where it burned down with the family portraits and jewelry and things like that. So if you want to know why we don't have any pictures of the Banister family, that's probably
Yeah.
That is the reason. And so, we dig for things. I mean, the portrait of John Banister above the mantle was painted in 1951 by a female artist who was pretty famous and now has a highway marker in her name in Lynchburg.
Sally Mahood, I believe how it's pronounced.
And that's a very good likeness taken from that etching that Davis mentioned before. She did a nice job of copying that painting, if you will. But that's the only family portrait of the men. His second wife is hanging in the hall here, which is on long-term loan from the city of Petersburg. But, we really just don't know a whole lot about what they look like.
The etching of John Banister that painting above is based on comes from it was an 1870s work by Henry Bram Hall, who was the same artist that did several of the etchings on the American currencies, like Franklin, that sort of thing. But that was based on what was likely either an etching or an original painting done in the 18th century, which we no longer have today. The oldest image that we technically have of Banister is, if you look at the brochure on your way out, there's a V&HC daguerreotype. So in 1840s, likely 1840s, 1850s photograph, which was, or in this case, daguerreotype of a etching or miniature of John Banister. So that would technically be the oldest image that we would have of him today. But no original 18th century portrait of him exists. That we know of.
And the etching was found at Oxford University in the Bodleian Library in a book. Isn't that right, Davis? I mean, I think that's where it came from.
Yeah, the etching was, the 1870s etching was not, it wasn't just like one thing that was done. It was like a mass-produced, sort of widely available piece that people could have in their homes.
Of him.
Of him, yes. Yeah. That you can actually see you can see it in the room over here on the corner.
Yeah, it's in the corner in that yellow room in there.
But to answer the question, was John Banister a founding father? I mean, that kind of limits your status and your ability to be as well known if you don't even have an original painting of the guy or really know what he looked like. But as I delve into it in my in the last chapter of my thesis as well. But Banister's accomplishments and what he's done sort of gets overshadowed by his Virginia contemporaries. I mean, if you're going up against the likes of Washington, Jefferson, Belize, like everybody else that's so famous and important, it's hard to stand out on your own, even if you did something as important as sign the nation's first constitution.
So, a lot has been made about Banister's military history and that kind of thing, and he fancies himself as being Colonel John Banister, and it was a cavalry appellation, if you will. I mean, that was what he liked to do, was horses, and he liked being a colonel of the cavalry and the militia, but he was a lousy officer. I mean, on paper he looks okay, but he was the one defending the city of Petersburg from the British invasion. And he was down there on his horse and with his troops and that kind of thing. And when the British troops got downtown and started looking around, they said, "Where are the colonials?" Well, Banister had taken them across the bridge down here near the Martin Luther King Bridge, which was a low bridge with wood platform boards all along. He took them to what is now Colonial Heights, and the British were saying, "Well, there they are. They're the colonials on the heights," which is how the name Colonial Heights got started. And they pulled up the boards on the bridge as they were leaving Petersburg to go up the hill, so the British couldn't follow them and chase them on that bridge. So, I mean, there's your military leader.
It's actually kind of interesting that Banister is so obsessed with horse racing and equestrianism, because his family line, I think for his grandfather, father, all of them had fallen from their horses multiple times and broken their legs. I think that's actually in 1785. That's what Banister uses to resign from his services, cavalryman.
Because he fell.
In 85, he fell, broke his leg, and that was I guess that was his disability leave.
So I have a question. That a letter from Washington is so unique. It gives the insights that it does. I'm just curious whether Ken Burns was aware of it when he was making his Revolution documentary, because that's something that would have stood out.
I actually just me and my girlfriend watched the documentary, but I don't think Ken Burns has got time to mess with Bannister. He's got 6 parts and he's got a bigger story to tell than just him.
But that was at Valley Forge, you gave the insight into Washington's thinking of the time.
Yeah, it's a fair point. There's a lot that you can, I mean, and especially with the PBS series, there's only so much that you can address in the time period that you have. But in order to do that, you would essentially have to explain the background of Banister and who he was for that letter to have context and meaning. So I can understand why.
You gotta
Like
be patient to follow the thread of that story all along to get to the good stuff. But I do think it's significant. I mean, to have a letter from George Washington where he's basically saying to Banister, you know, we're gonna lose this war.
Because he spent a lot of time on Valley Forge and the peril that we were feeling and all
Right.
some of the things in letter.
And he was embarrassed that the officers that were enlisted from Virginia were resigning left and right. He wanted to go home. It was really cold.
It's like, what kind of message does that send to the British?
Exactly. The British could see that going on. You have 90 officers from Virginia resign all at about the same time. Very embarrassing for Washington.
That sort of segues into our next point or question that we wanted to raise, is that how important was the Committee of Arrangements to winning the war? As a legislative body, I mean, it's important, but it's definitely not to the degree of Washington or Baron von Steuben, who were responsible for really putting and reorganizing the army and putting the practicalities into it. But I mean, legislatively and democratically, or governmentally speaking, I think that was definitely more significant than it would lead to believe.
Yeah, the committee and his position on it, I think, is really important. It was maybe a stroke of luck. They picked the right guy. They could figure out how to move food and people around and clothe them and do all that sort of thing. I mean, that was really his job, and I think he did that pretty well. But it's not the kind of thing you're known for in the annals of history, right?
That's right.
Critical to maybe the outcome of some of the battles and maybe even the war itself, but not the kind of thing that is heroic.
Being the sword of the revolution has more of a ring to it.
Yeah.
And that also brings up the next point, or the next question we wanted to raise, was the other names on the Articles of Confederation. Sort of going back to the founders' question, how significant was the Banister name, and were even some of these other people recognizable? And for the most part, not really. I mean, you have the Lees, you have Richard Henry and Lightfoot, which of course, they're the Lees, they're famous. They're up there with the names of Washington, Jefferson, and all the important figures in the Revolution. But I mean, Thomas Adams, John Harvey, like not everybody that was on the Articles was significant to the point where you would think they would have their own museum and interpretation.
No, I mean, and working on the Articles of Confederation was kind of thankless work. You know, they were trying to put together a document that would live on and try to unify the 13 colonies and all this sort of thing, but they really had no idea what they were doing. I mean, there were people on that list who were farmers. They were, I mean, from all the states and that kind of thing. They were not legal experts. They didn't draft anything. I mean, the document itself is highly criticized in history as being just not what it should have been. But you're looking at it from measuring the significance of that document compared to our own Constitution, which you know, some very famous people like James Madison is well known for. That is mostly his work.
What's perhaps most fascinating about the Articles of Confederation is that it shows Banister's evolution as a politician and throughout his career. Since the beginning and the Constitution, there's essentially, or the creation of the Constitution creates the rise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So you have the folks like, you have your Washingtons and your Northeasterners, you have your folks that are approving of the Constitution and the federal government as a means of unity. And then you have more of your Virginians like your George Masons and your Patrick Henrys who are saying this is a bad idea, it needs amendments, you need your Bill of Rights. Bannister sort of falls in the middle. When he first signs the Articles of Confederation, he's sort of going for the state's mentality, you know, with unity towards your colonies. But as he progresses throughout his career, you start to see how he, traveling to all these states and all these fields, says, yeah, we need more unity than what's present. So it makes sense that in 1787, when he holds a committee here at Petersburg and is essentially all in favor for the Constitution, it shows his evolution in his character. He's going from just being a Virginian-centered person to thinking, well, we have a union now. We need to have a collection of 13 colonies, and we need a government or a document that represents that. So it's interesting to see how he sort of changed his mind towards the end of his life and started to support the Constitution just right before he died, actually. We get that question a lot, is that if he chose to support it, why didn't he sign it? Well, less than a year after he had done that meeting, he was dead in 1788, so.
Yeah. Banister was a political animal. That much I feel fairly confident about. I mean, he knew politics, he knew how to get his way, and a perfect example of that is, you know, he was the first mayor of the city of Petersburg, not the town of Petersburg. The city of Petersburg was a combination of Blandford and Pocahontas Island, Ravenscroft, and Petersburg. And that was 1784 or
1784 is
when they were merged together into the city of Petersburg, and Banister was the first mayor of the city of Petersburg. But to get there, he was in the middle of a gerrymandering scheme that worked. This house was built in Dinwiddie County.
Right.
It wasn't built in Petersburg.
Oh.
That boundary line got moved about 1,000 feet or whatever it took.
Right, West Petersburg.
So this now became a building where he lived in the city of Petersburg and made him eligible to run for public office.
And what's interesting to point to that we did not mention before is that Banister's father is just called Captain John Banister in literature, but he was actually a member of the crew with William Byrd II. So if you read the diaries of William Byrd or his journey where he documents the districting and the founding of Richmond and Petersburg, Banister's father is a part of that journey. He's a part of one of the men that actually goes on that voyage and helps found Richmond and Petersburg. Banister River out in, I think it's Halifax County, that's named after Banister's father. That's where the name Banister River comes from. So the Banister family has been quite significant in the history of Virginia as far back as contributing to the scientific revolution. His grandfather, laying out the founding of Richmond and Petersburg, and of course becoming the first mayor of Petersburg in a revolutionary prowess.
The bottom piece.
Yeah. And John Banister's father was a notorious slave trader, basically. I mean, he brought in lots and lots of slaves down the James River.
The collection, Captain Collection of Customs on the James River in the 1730s, attributing to the international slave trade. And by that aspect, using that as a means of power, establishing his name in Virginia society.
So it's all kind of interesting. I mean, it was a different time, different life. But I mean, these heroes that we talk about, you know, on the tours of this house and so on, for the most part, weren't heroes. They were people doing their job competently, making money for themselves and their family. And so they really weren't that much different than you and me. But there are the stories, you know, and that's what we're looking for, is to find those stories and sort of bring it to light.
It's one reason why we invest so heavily in primary sources and understanding the material of what you're reading, because you can actually see from handwritten letters like these the characteristics and personalities of the people that we attribute all of these characteristics to. Which brings into the next question, the last one that we have is, are there more Banister letters out there in archives and libraries? Most definitely, but There's only so much that I can search in several years. There's definitely a series of correspondence with Robert Morris, for those who are familiar, the financier of the Revolution. Him and Banister had a significant relationship in the 1770s, working together as business partners. Morris didn't fare as well, ended up in debtor's prison towards the end of his life, and Banister also did not end up well financially towards his end as well, but that's just one of the founding fathers that Banister would share correspondence with. And there's likely more letters out there between his family members and other folks as well that would further highlight his personality. Banister actually does not have any surviving correspondence with both his first and second wife at all. Does it exist? Possibly. As far as we can tell, there's nothing, which actually brings into the reasoning. For years, it was interpreted that Banister was married 3 times, but like we said at the very beginning of the presentation, the family name gets very confusing as to which Banister you're talking about, so that would have referred to his father being remarried. And so for that reason, Banister's correspondence with his family members, with his wives, and even some of these other founders is hard to determine because there's not always a readily available source of material to highlight on that relationship. Founders Online is fantastic. If you ever get some spare time, that's the place to read up, learn more.
One of the things that I've said about Banister for years is he just comes across as a smug, wealthy, spoiled child.
Careful, we're in his house still.
But I think that is probably what he was. I have it in my mind that he and his wives didn't get along very well. There's 7 children to the contrary, so that's a footnote. But you see no personality from him in the letters and even in the stories. And so, you just sort of wonder what he was really like. He was, probably 5'4", a little pudgy. The pudgy comes from living well, okay? But a lot of them look like that.
Visually very similar to Robert Morris, which
Well, and so the answer to some of what we're speculating about is that you really can't go out and just find stuff. A lot of it's accidental. And I mean, what we have found at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in the last year is wonderful. We're going to do a big talk about it and a food-related demonstration. You want to tell them a little bit about the cookbooks?
So there's, at the VMHC within recent years, they made a discovery of cookbooks, which not necessarily related to Banister, but later in the history of Battersea, are dated to be around the early 1800s antebellum period that show recipes from the time period from the people that were in Battersea. It's attributed mainly to Banister's daughter-in-law, and shows recipes from the time period as well as birth dates and names of some of the enslaved that lived with the family at the time. And so these 2 cookbooks were at the Virginia History Museum. They're donated in the 70s. We made a note of them, kind of forgot about them, and now we're trying to bring some more awareness to those and get some of those pieces out for some programming that we'd like to do here in the future.
So the names and ages of the enslaved children in a book like that could well have been stored in this building right behind the bell is an extraordinary discovery. There are almost no other examples of slave children's names and ages. They weren't recorded by the owners for any particular reason, and yet they're all in these books. The pages are very fragile. They're very brown and brittle and that kind of thing. But I mean, there are alcoholic beverage recipes in there, as well as just the kind of things that they would cook for the owners of this building.
They're actually,
And that came into the museum by a donation from somebody we've never heard of.
There actually is in the book what we believe is a diagram for that building outside the window, which is which we interpret as a enslaved kitchen. And the diagram actually shows a measurement like for the foundation and sizing, which we still need to confirm and measure through, but it's likely that that was the original foundation when that was being constructed during that time period. So post Banister period, long after his death, but still interesting to the history of the house.
So we're going, and I don't know how much you know about this from just watching things on the website, but we have hired structural engineers to start work as early as next week on that building. I want to be sure it's not going to fall down because it's capable of that, and it's been moved before from some other place on the property to where it sits right now. And the city of Petersburg has given us $100,000 to look into that building. And that's how we're spending the money, is getting professional advice on structural integrity of the building, what were the rooms used for. There were sleeping quarters upstairs. There was a double-sided chimney inside where you could use it for heat and also for laundry as you boil clothing and all this kind of thing. But to have something, 2 books that probably were kept in that building, that were signed, not signed, but I mean they were written by the occupants of the building and their families, is just an unbelievable discovery, and which we'll end up doing something more than just a talk about it. I mean, this could be something that would be published because of its rarity.
Yes.
And so we're looking forward to really getting into that, and thankfully the city of Petersburg wants to know as well. So they're supporting it.
Yeah.
So for Banister letters and anything else that you might want to read, Founders Online is going to be your best resource. They have a wonderful website transcribed with all the original letters, contextualized with footnotes, make it very easy to read. Library of Congress, if you want to take a look at the originals for the Banister pieces, they have them, the majority of them stored there. And several from the New York Public Library as well. They have a collection of Banister's adventures in the Northeast, talking about his time during the Revolution as well. And to that, I just wanted to turn it over to any questions that you all might have.
Did you ever figure out what those 2 little concrete buildings are?
Yeah, you can only actually see one of them right now. The other one on the other end up here looks like a bunker, but it's completely overgrown. You can't even see it. The other one is right outside the door here. Miss Perkinson, and the Perkinsons lived here in the 50s and 60s. We think had those constructed so that the people working on the property and in the yard didn't have to come inside and use the restroom.
I thought they were outhouses.
We've got the very early doors in the basement, bathroom doors, I mean, that look to be 100, 150 years old, which we think these were probably done in the 40s, maybe. They have running water out there. So that's what we think it was. Interesting, but nobody's bothered to try to take them down. They're not contributing features, to the building or the property, so they're not historic, but there they live.
A 20th century reminder of
Necessities of life. Such. Right. Any more questions?
I'm astonished that, you were talking about just those documents surviving in that building. You think about water and everything else, but a lot of plantations and older homes that are in their own home burned. Like you
Yes.
said, they burned down. In Dinwiddie, I know several burned down. It was not uncommon, so it is amazing that it is still here.
It's a rare survivor.
Yes.
No question. Yes, sir.
In terms of things that were in the house or the house itself, were there ever any inventories or tax records that you could go back to?
So no inventory of Battersea exists that we've been able to find yet, but there are many, many tax records that Banister had in both Dinwiddie and Petersburg during the time. That's how you get to figure out fun things like how many chariots did Banister own for his horse racing community / probable gambling hobby. And things other things like how many enslaved people he owned, cattle, that sort of thing, equestrian taste and that sort of thing.
People ask me all the time, where's the original furniture that was in a building like this? Well, it certainly didn't survive. I will tell you that the records that we have seen about Banister and the furnishings here, all of that furniture was destroyed by the British on the 3 times that they were here. And the stories that we've seen say that it was taken out to the road, like Upper Appomattox Street, and trampled by the horses. So all of it was English furniture, which makes sense because that's how Banister grew up. He was educated in England. His family came from England. And it was also a little early for local Petersburg production of its own colonial era furniture. The first furniture I may have mentioned a little while ago was about 1770 in the city. And the first shipment of mahogany down the Appomattox River to Petersburg was 1770.
Wow.
The first newspaper in the city of Petersburg was 1770. So, you know, it was about that time that things were really kicking off here. People had money, and they were doing well, and they were starting to buy local. But it took a while to get to that. So there is nothing that we have access to or have ever seen that belonged to John Banister, insofar as furniture and paintings and so on in this house. So we do the best we can, knowing that we can't even find the originals, but we do, you know, try to buy things of the period that would have been here or could have been here. These maps were big, etchings were big during those time periods, and the furniture that we've got here, for the most part, is correct and good furniture from the early colonial and, well, mid-colonial, and then even some early federal period up to about 1810, 1815 or so. That's what would have been here later than Banister, but that would have been the period that we're furnishing and painting the walls to try to connect to what was on the wall. This is Judge May's paint color called chrome yellow, very popular in France in 1810, 1820, that kind of thing. He knew about it. Banister would never have known that. But Judge May did, because he was competing with the big boys as an industrialist and so on. And we've talked about, you know, how he may have taken advantage of that situation. So, yes, sir.
How was the painting over here of Banister's Second Life preserved? And you know, so much of everything that was in here was destroyed. Do you know anything about how that survived and where it was?
Well, what we know is that it was donated to the city of Petersburg by John Banister Stalling's grandfather.
That would be his father.
Father.
Yeah.
A branch of the Banister family lived in Lynchburg for years and years, and maybe John, who is 60, 65 or so by now, he was on our board for a while early on, and he has just gone cold on us. We haven't been able to reach him. He made some early donations, but that portrait was given to the city of Petersburg. And so I asked the city if it could hang here, because they didn't even have it hanging on the wall anywhere. So I wanted it for here, because it should be here.
Perfect.
And so they were happy to do that. And then, you know, this portrait of John Banister over the mantel there was given to us by John Banister Stalling when he was on the board here 15 years or so ago. So we gladly took that. Why he didn't want it, I don't know. But I mean, it gives us something to hang on the wall we can point to and say that's a Banister, right?
Any other questions?
When is the last time somebody actually lived in the house? Was it the lady you referenced in the 50s and 60s?
1985
Wow.
is what I've been told. There was a proposal in front of City Council in 1985 to turn this property, which has 37 acres today, and 37 acres then too, turned it into a subdivision. They were gonna take Battersea down and build new housing here, in the 80s. And city council got some good advice from people, historians and real estate agents that deal in historic properties, and they said you just can't do that. And they didn't approve the rezoning and that sort of thing. The city managed the property here for about 30 years before we bought it. We bought it in 2011, 2012. So it sat vacant. The city kept the holes in the roof plugged. They cut the grass outside. They did nothing else for 30 years of sort of maintaining a major historic landmark. This building was one of the first put on the National Register of Historic Places in 1969. And then in 2006, that status was elevated, believe it or not, to having national significance, which puts this building on the same plane, same par as Monticello and the Statue of Liberty.
Wow.
So that's the company we keep. And you know, it puts pressure on us, I guess. We've got a lot of responsibility to try to maintain this and learn about it and keep it up. So it's a significant building in everybody's opinion.
Because I don't know anything about any of this at all, is it advantageous or disadvantage for a city to own a property like this? Like when it became theirs, and you know, why would you want it, not want it?
That might stem a little, that might get a little political, but generally speaking, house museums and museums like of this accord are like typically owned by private foundations and places like that receive donor funding to be able to support something, because houses like these typically require lots of maintenance to be able to be preserved, and especially for a building of this size, it requires input from the state, from historical communities, ensuring that you have the right builders and things to do it in the first place, and typically that requires just so much organization and leadership to be able to accomplish something that's that demanding of a chore to keep up with.
While I was sitting here, I could hear the cash register ringing.
When we bought the building in 2012, I think I made an appearance at city council meeting one night, because they asked me to come up and just tell them what we're gonna do. You know, we've agreed we're gonna sell it to you, but what are you gonna do and what's it gonna cost? I put up a slide that night that had a $5 million price on it for the amount of work that needed to be done here. We have 6 buildings. Most of the others are not of historic significance, but we've got all these buildings and a responsibility to care for them. We knew this building was going to be incredibly expensive. We have never used historic tax credits here, although we've talked about it many times. It requires us to go to the bank and borrow a lot of money to pay their workers, and after all the work is done, then the people who bought the credits will put their money up. But I didn't want to go to the bank and borrow $1 million, $2 million, and so on. I mean, who's going to pay that back?
Right.
And so there's a lot of private donation money in this building, including mine. But we've had very faithful foundations, people who want to see this completed. The Cameron Foundation, the Mary Morton Parsons Foundation, the Cabell Foundation, the Rollo Bottomore Foundation, even the Department of Historic Resources has given us money.
Nice.
It is so important to so many people that, you know, we've been able to live off of that for a number of years, and we've gotten what you see accomplished done with that. And the Daughters of the American Revolution, is Sydney still here? The John Banister chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution in Petersburg sold their chapter house. I was involved with that as a lawyer, and their board, which I was not on, voted that the net proceeds from the sale of that house downtown should come to Battersea.
Wow.
And so, we used that to, put in the septic system, to build the first bathroom inside here. And now the DAR chapter has their meetings here. We signed an agreement with them and said in perpetuity, you may hold your meetings at Battersea and have an event once a year, something like that. No charge to you, but we want you to enjoy the place and we appreciate it. That's the way we handle that.
We've got about 8 minutes left. Are there any other questions that would be answered in that time?
Worn out. Everybody's worn out. Well, thank you. Okay.
Oh, we got 2 more.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think it's wonderful that you found these letters, if everything else was destroyed in that house. I mean, this has really, really been interesting, and thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.